generally speaking, like it's so complex, and one of the things that really boggles my mind is you guys heard about this like secret prison at the Ministry of the Interior, maybe a month ago now, that was uncovered by these American soldiers, and like there were people there who showed signs of like abuse, which really means a code word for torture, and that like everyone with any authority sort of denied knowing that this was happening. Well, there's no secret, because when I was there, this got uncovered in like late November or December. Like when I was over there in September, I knew about it, and like almost everyone I knew, who I talked to, knew about it. It was no surprise to anyone that there was a secret prison there. The CPT team had spoken with people who had been the victims of torture and had been killed there, and it was certainly operating with the knowledge of not only like the Ministry of the Interior, the head of the head Interior Minister, who claimed to have no knowledge of it publicly, and the entire Iraqi government, and certainly the American politicians, who control like the American Department of Defense, certainly authorities there, and certainly certain American soldiers knew about that place. It was no secret, but it was uncovered by people in the American military who must have known what torture was going on there and known it to be wrong, and deliberately forced everyone else's hand by going in there, raiding it, and uncovering it. Which, I don't know how they did it. I don't know if they used violence, if they killed people, if they however it happened. It was a really good thing, and a lot of people probably knew about it. And it was probably some like renegade American, colonel or whoever decided, we're going in here and we're going to force everyone else's hand to expose it. I don't really know that. I'm just speculating. But so there is some Americans trying to do some good in the midst of all of this chaos over there. But
it's just confusing. Like, how do they think? Like, whoever it is that's bullying around this guy who's been in jail for over a year and keeps being told, "Oh yeah, you'll be released. Don't worry. We know that you're no threat." Like, that could potentially be my cousin who thinks he's fighting for freedoms and who thinks, like, in a way, rightfully so, but in a way, it's like they have to see the blatant contradiction.
I think
if it is that convoluted,
I think a lot of soldiers are really frustrated with the bureaucracy of it all and the convolutedness of it. But I think that they learn, like I learned, that it's a very complex situation, and unfortunately, American soldiers don't have the opportunity that I had. I was living in the green zone in an apartment, where an Iraqi family lived in the same building. Iraqi people lived on the street. When I wanted to go eat, I would go, up the street to the market to buy food. If I wanted to send an email, I would go up to the internet cafe. Americans, they don't do that. They're stuck. American soldiers are stuck in their bases, or they're stuck in the green zone. Some of these pictures you might see here show soldiers interacting with Iraqi people. Those pictures have got to be at least 2 years old, because that does not happen anymore. American soldiers cannot interact with Iraqis in any sort of informal way, unless it's like one of those sort of publicity stunts where they like deliver toys to the orphanage or something like that, which thereby endangers all of those children at the orphanage, like severely, of being targeted for some sort of violence. There's no opportunity for Americans to really meet Iraqis informally unless they're arresting them or shooting at them or driving behind them in their Humvees and Bradley armored fighting vehicles. I mean, or if they're working with Iraqi translators or something like that. But there's no chance for all of those are like really formal or like violent interactions. There's no opportunity for nonviolent and informal interactions between American soldiers and Iraqis, and so that I think is a huge barrier to to Americans who are there. Most of them military personnel, to seeing another way or seeing another side of what their presence there is doing. I don't think most Americans see the fact that their presence is dividing Iraqi society, because we went in with the myth that this Iraqi society was already really divided. Like the colonial power, like the Belgians who colonized Rwanda and divided the country between Hutus and Tutsis, or the British who colonized India and divided everything between Hindus and Muslims. That sort of polarizing influence is happening now in Iraq, and we're doing the same thing that all colonial powers have always done, and that's divide and conquer the indigenous society. And it's done through myth and propaganda in ways that I don't even think, in some cases, the people who are responsible for it really even understand. And I don't know. Like one thing that we were told over and over again is what happens if the Americans leave? And we heard, well, if the Americans leave, there might be a civil war in Iraq. But if the Americans stay, there will be a civil war in Iraq. And in my mind, that civil war is probably already started a long time ago in certain ways. Can it be abetted? I think it can be if the Americans leave now. I mean, I do. I think that Iraqis will come together somehow. There's a strong feeling, sense of national unity still. People like Muqtada al-Sadr get really panned, but he's someone who's really deliberate and very public about trying to bring Iraqis together across ethnic groups. And he's a politician. I mean, we met with him, and he plays a game, and he uses nonviolent human rights convoys as a cover to ship arms. Maybe, I don't know, but he employs both violence and nonviolent tactics. But he's a person who's really trying to form, a unified Iraq, where the other people are really trying to divide the country across those lines. And I think most Iraqis really identify with that desire for a national unity. So I think that that's possible. If the Americans leave right away, will there be more violence immediately, an upsurge in violence? Yeah. And do I have a program for them leaving? No, but the sooner they do it, the better. I mean, that's all I can think is that if the Americans there are exacerbating the conflict in the long run, it will never stop as long as the Americans are there. And the Americans are building military bases there that will last 15 to 30 years. I mean, they pulled out of Saudi Arabia. They used to be all over Saudi Arabia. That was one of Osama bin Laden's 3 criticisms at the time of September 11th. He criticized the U.S. support of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, the U.S. UN sanctions on Iraq, and the U.S. occupation, or rather, U.S. military presence in the Holy Land of Saudi Arabia. The U.S. since has ended the sanctions on Iraq, although they now occupy Iraq. They continue to support Palestine. They continue to support Israeli occupation of Palestine, but they have since withdrawn all of their troops from Saudi Arabia. The U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia isn't there anymore, and they're now making Iraq their permanent military base in the region. They're building tons of Air Force and Army bases across the country that aim to be there permanently. It's not a short-term sort of occupation that they have in mind.
So it's pretty unrealistic that they would ever leave. I mean, the United States hardly ever leaves a country that it's occupied.
It's really, I really do think I think in that sense, yeah, if you want to look at it that way, it's very unlikely. In the other sense, this. I mean, I don't know. I think that yeah, it is in some ways, but I think that there is an opportunity for them, for the Iraqis and the Americans and other people across the world to make the occupation untenable and to make it stop. I don't know how. I mean, coming together, sending people over there, and letting the Americans learn about what's really happening. In Central America in the 1980s, there was tons of people who were going and visiting and learning about it, and that led to at least a minor shift in American foreign policy there. And it led to better conditions, if not not everything's hunky dory there, but in El Salvador and Nicaragua, things are better in some ways than when they were during the time of the junta and the ultras and stuff like that. So, I don't know. It's, if the Americans leave immediately, whenever they leave, there's probably going to be an upsurge in violence, and that's going to happen. But in the long term, the longer they stay, the harder it is going to be for our Iraqi society to come together because it's just being polarized, like at an alarming rate. That was my experience.
My question is this: did you have any personal experience on, like, sometimes the Sunnis are creating problems for the Shias, and the Bani Sadr's group are doing harm to the Sunnis. They're doing it to their own. For example, in something like a funeral, they had 50 people died.
Yeah.
See, the average people don't they seem to be recognizing so and so is Sunni who is doing it, or the Shia militia will do that. No, they just seem to be totally lost.
It's hard to say. One thing that we heard over and over again from people is that Sunni and Shia, Christian, Muslim, is that before the U.S. invasion, it never mattered whether you were Sunni or Shia. It didn't matter because people intermarried. You had friends and neighbors who were one or the other, and you never knew, you never cared. And I'm sure in certain areas where there was higher concentrations of Shia, like you knew where someone was maybe Sunni, but in places like Baghdad, a diverse metropolis, like it has 6 million people there. People didn't know, they didn't care, it wasn't a big deal. And other places where it was very integrated, and where there's, Iraq is a mixed country, and it wasn't so divided. And as the U.S. really sort of tried to put uprising and in the early '90s, that never happened. And the Kurds, while they're a very distinct group, still have a lot of nationalist feeling, much more so than probably the Kurds in, say, Turkey, which are have much more feelings of Kurdish nationalism than maybe Iraqi Kurds, who are much more have much more strong feelings of Iraqi nationalism, or at least they're very mixed. And I think that in an everyday sense, yeah, people are recognizing that Sunnis are targeting Shias, and that now Shias are targeting Sunnis, and especially the military, police, and army are often dominated by Shias because Americans put and encouraged and invited Shia political parties to control the Interior Ministry and the Ministry of Defense and the government in general as a whole, and through systems of patronage, that's who gets those jobs, or that's who applies for those jobs, and those are really the only jobs to be had. I heard figures around the time that I went to Iraq that unemployment was around 50%. And I'm telling you, as much as Iraqi police are responsible for a lot of torture and abuses, it's hard to blame the people who want to take those jobs to put bread on their family's table, because there's nothing else out there. You know what I mean? There's nothing else out there. And the U.S. presence is, the dialogue, the U.S. just talks Sunni, Shia. And when we were over there, we started, are you Sunni, are you Shia, what do you think about those things? Because we're North Americans, right? And on not one or two occasions, people said, would you just quit asking us that? It is not important. We don't want to talk about it, we don't care about it, we want to come together, and you even asking that question is divisive. Do you understand? Even though our focus as North Americans on the differences between Sunni and Shia is dividing the country, even my talking about it right now is divisive for those people.
Yeah, I know a little bit.
And that's what the occupier wants to do.
I know a little bit about this because back in India, each state is like France, Germany, Italy, speak different languages, have different food systems. But when it comes to getting together, we all think we are Indians first. We may speak Kannada, we may speak Tamil, Gujarati, Hindi, Bengali, but when it comes to together, we are all Indians. That's where, in the sense, I think what you're saying is very much true. As long as somebody from outside is not meddling, the Shia, Sunni, Kurd doesn't make any difference. That's why I think we are Iraqis.
Right, like what's going on politically? I always hear about new elections and then another form of the Constitution and then elections again. Then like NPR spends an entire day interviewing people in Baghdad as they're going to the polls and asking them how exciting is it. But then you don't really hear about the results, or maybe I just don't hear about the results, nor do I understand at all what difference it made. But of course my cynical mind wants to think that it's all just sort of a puppet game of, hey look, let's throw this voting down on you. Like I heard, maybe somebody, I think somebody told me that like the day before the presidential elections, well, leading up to the presidential elections, as opposed to like George Bush having a year and a half of, you know, like canvassing and getting his word out there and all that and raising money, they have a couple of months between who's actually gonna be on the ballot and when the elections were. And then there was like hundreds of people on the ballot.
Yeah, you know, like, there's like 300 political parties in Iraq. And they have a parliamentary system, so like, you know, like, regional parties are represented, like, you might have like a Kurdish party, and they're on the ballot all across Iraq. But they're not gonna get any votes in Basra, because there's not any Kurds living in Basra. So, you know, the people who are elected are going to be from the regional area. Individuals might not be a part of any party, but they can get on the ballot too. So there's like over 300 people on the ballot. So like, when the U.S. began the occupation, they had this Coalition Provisional Authority, which were basically Americans who were appointed to run the Iraqi government and the Iraqi bureaucracy. And they, you know, incorporated Iraqis. And then they had these like interim election. They formed an interim government, which is like, I don't know, like when they had their first election, they formed an interim government, and Iraqis, not only in Iraq but in Detroit and in London, could vote as well. And so they all voted. And they formed this interim government, which like became the government of Iraq and was tasked with creating a constitution for the country. That constitution was created with like massive protests by Sunnis. Like Sunnis, in large part, did not participate in the election of the interim government. And then when the constitution was created, in many ways they were locked out of that process, and a lot of their demands were not met in the forming of the constitution. When the referendum was held, this really complicated referendum, but basically. It had to pass by 50% across the country, but if 3 governorates or provinces failed the Constitution by, I think, 2/3 or more, then the Constitution would fail. It failed in 2, I think it failed in 2 governorates, or 1 governorate, and came very close to failing by 2/3 in 2 or 3 other governorates, but it just barely missed that margin. So it passed, and it won by definitely over a majority across the country, but it came really close to failing by that, because it almost failed by 2/3 in 3 governorates, but it didn't quite make it. So the Constitution passed, and that was October 15th that election was held. Then in December, I think it was December 15th, they had like elections for a new government. And then I never really heard much about who won, but my understanding is like the people who won before won again, and the government is largely unchanged. Like the same coalition who had the majority, the coalition of parties who had the majority before hold the power now. And the main 2 parties are the Scary Party, the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, and there's a very similar party in Iran, the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and that is by far the majority party in Iran, and they run the show in Iran. And then the Scary Party, and then the Dawa Party, which is also a Shia party that has very close ties to Iraqis of Iranian descent living in Iraq, and some of whom were exiled to Iraq. So those 2 parties are powerhouse parties. A lot of people have broad support, because my experience there was that Shia people tended to gravitate towards hierarchical and charismatic or role-based leaders who had authority because they were directly descended from the prophets, like Sayyid Muqtada al-Sadr is a direct descendant of the prophet, or the Grand Ayatollah Sistani, he's also a direct descendant of the prophet, is my understanding. So those powerful figures are the family that controlled the Skiri party is from Najaf, and they I forget their name. It starts with them, but they control the Badr brigades, who are associated with the military wing of the Skiri party, and so that. Those are the big powerhouses, and where I lived, we lived across the street from the communist and the Communist Party of Iraq, which is a European style communist party, and the other secular party, the secular alliance of secular parties, they have a small minority in the government, and Sunni parties and Kurdish parties are loosely aligned with other coalitions, but these Iranian, they're not really from Iran, but they have Iranian descent or they were exiled to Iran. The Iranian parties really control the Iraqi government and a lot of the important bureaucratic institutions.
That wouldn't be the choice of the Americans, I presume. So it's in a way indicative that the elections were somewhat original.
Yeah, the Americans put this guy Iyad Allawi, who was a secular Shia, in charge of the interim government. He was before the election, he was part of this coalition provisional authority or whatever. He was associated with them, and so yeah, he wasn't the Joffrey, who's the current prime minister, wasn't the Americans' #1 pick to head things up, but the Americans worked with them very closely.
How many CPTers and Muslim peacemaker members do you have, and how do you measure the value of what they do?
When I was there were four people on team at the time. There were 6 delegates. I don't know how many, and I don't think that they now, at this point in time, since some of the team members went missing, are making public who's there and how many people are there. I think there's, generally speaking, there's between 3 and 6 or 7 CPTers there at all times. Muslim peacemaker teams are more of a loose group of people in Najaf and Karbala. They're Iraqis who live there and they just have their daily life sort of thing going on. And it's less of a full-time sort of thing and more of a vocation that they'll do when they, it doesn't consume all of their time except for maybe 1 or 2 of them who really put a lot of energy into it. The impact is hard to measure because they don't really do anything. I mean, they work for human rights. They're one of only 2 that I know of international human rights organizations in the main part in Iraq outside of Kurdistan. The other one is Human Rights Watch, and they have one foreign-born worker, and she's the only worker, and she's Jordanian, and she's married to an Iraqi, a Kurdish Iraqi member of parliament, and then there's CPT, and they have 4 or 5, 6 people depending on what month it is, and it's they do a lot of work. They work for the rights of detainees, trying to help them get in touch with their families, to have them either charged or to have get them due process, not necessarily released, but to have them be treated fairly and according to international and human rights law. And they work to accompany a large group of Palestinians who are suffering really severely under the current regime. They were publicly favored, but not actually favored under the previous regime. They received some public housing subsidies that other Iraqis maybe didn't get, but they were largely excluded from Iraqi society even in the days of Saddam Hussein. But public opinion is really swung against them now, and they're being forced into ghettos, and they now have to register every 2 months with the government. So a lot of them want to leave the country, but they can't get passports or travel documents, and none of the neighboring countries will accept them. So the CBT recently accompanied a lot of them to the Syrian border, and they continue to work with Palestinians in Baghdad and work to support the Muslim peacemaker teams. It's hard to measure or quantify what they're doing there. It's really a mission of being present to the Iraqi people more than anything else.
Maybe just your question is the
Oh,
last one.
I was just gonna recommend that we have a break or something.
Oh, okay.
It's getting pretty late.
So,
Yeah.
if you were going to say something to that effect,
Yeah, I was gonna say maybe, because you could probably hang around a little bit.
I can hang around, I can talk all night if anybody wants to. And you guys can look at these pictures and stuff. And these photos right here of our Sadr city, which is a slum in northern Baghdad, and it's got like, I mean, it's a neighborhood, but there's 2 million people living there. It's really bad conditions. I mean, generally speaking, Iraq is not a third world country, but there's places where there are third world conditions going on there.
Thank you, Joe. Just to let everyone know that Camp Casey's, this was like the kind of kickoff, Camp Casey even tomorrow it starts and it goes for 2 weeks down at St. Augustine. It's right down the road here, and different events are going to be going on, so check out the Michiana Peace and Justice Coalition website for a schedule. And yeah.
Yeah, Sheila Provencher, who was a member of the Christian Peacemaker teams in Baghdad when I was there, is going to be talking at some point in time. And she's a really, really good writer, and she's also a good talker, and she's a wonderful person. And if you want to know more, she could tell you a lot more than I could ever tell you about what's happening there. Thanks.
Well, we're talking about the same Sheila, but yeah.
Yeah, she's